Washington, D.C., December 1, 1959. 12 nations sign a treaty inside a State Department conference room. There are no cameras, no televised address, no crowd outside. The document is 9 pages long. And by the time the ink dries, an entire continent, larger than the United States and Mexico put together, has been quietly placed off limits to ordinary human beings. That continent is Antarctica. 14 million square kilometers of ice, mountains and buried lakes. And in the 66 years since that treaty was signed, in the middle of the Cold War, at the peak of nuclear tension between Washington and Moscow, it has never once been broken. Not by the Soviets. Not by the Americans. Not by anyone else. Think about what that actually means. 2 superpowers who could not agree on Berlin, on Cuba, on the moon, on grain shipments, on missile counts, on almost anything, agreed quietly and permanently that no private citizen and no independent expedition would ever set foot on Antarctica without government approval. And that agreement has held through 6 decades of every kind of geopolitical rupture you can name. Which raises an obvious question. It is the question this video is going to answer. What, exactly, is on that continent that made the 2 most hostile governments on Earth agree to lock the door and throw away the key? This is the story of the treaty itself. A document that reads like a scientific pact and functions like a security perimeter. It is the story of the flight crews who saw things over the ice they were ordered to never speak about again. It is the story of a map drawn in 1513, by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, that shows a coastline no living human being was supposed to have laid eyes on for another 300 years. It is the story of exclusion zones the size of European countries, of airspace closures that no tour operator has ever been allowed to cross, and of former U.S. Navy personnel who have finally gone on record about what they were told to bury. Some of what follows is documented material. It comes from the Antarctic Treaty archives held by the U.S. Department of State, from declassified logs of Operation Highjump, and from open reporting compiled over the last 2 decades, including the eyewitness accounts aggregated by the Y-Files documentary series on YouTube, which has spent years tracking these testimonies. Other parts of this story sit in a much grayer zone. They come from men who served in uniform, who agreed to speak only under first names or pseudonyms, and whose claims cannot be independently verified. Where we cross that line, from documented fact to unverified testimony, we will say so out loud every single time. Because there is a difference between the official reason you cannot go to Antarctica and the real one. The official reason is preservation of a pristine scientific environment. It is a reason that sounds reasonable. It is printed on every tour operator's website, repeated in every government press release, taught in every geography class. And it is a reason that quietly falls apart the moment you look at what is actually enforced down there, the size of the no-fly corridors, the armed escorts, the confiscated equipment, the classified debriefs, the men in civilian suits flying in from Washington whenever a flight crew sees something they were not supposed to see. Over the next 40 minutes, you will understand why the world's most powerful governments have spent 6 decades quietly agreeing on almost nothing except this. You will hear what the Piri Reis map is actually showing, and why cartographers still cannot explain it. You will hear what a U.S. Navy flight engineer saw in 1985, over a hole in the ice as wide as a football field, and why the men who debriefed him were not wearing military uniforms. You will hear about a scientific team that vanished from a base in Byrd Land in November of 1995, and returned days later in a state their rescue crew described as catatonic. And by the end, you will understand why, of every place on Earth you can freely travel to today, active war zones, failed states, even radioactive exclusion zones like Chernobyl and Fukushima, the one continent your government will not let you visit alone is the one that is supposedly empty of anything worth guarding. So let's start where the modern lock actually begins. Not in the ice. In a paneled room in Washington in the winter of 1959. To understand why you cannot go to Antarctica, you have to understand what those 12 nations were doing in the 2 years before they signed. Because the treaty did not appear out of nowhere. It appeared at the end of a scramble. Between 1957 and 1958, the world ran the International Geophysical Year. 67 countries agreed to coordinate scientific research across the planet, and one of the priority targets was Antarctica. Nations that had never sent a single expedition down there suddenly started building bases. The Americans built McMurdo. The Soviets built Mirny, then Vostok, deep in the interior. The British, the French, the Australians, the Norwegians, the Chileans, the Argentinians, all of them planted flags, laid runways, and began installing what were officially research huts but were in every practical sense forward operating bases. By late 1958, 7 of those nations were already making overlapping territorial claims. Argentina claimed a slice. Chile claimed a slice that overlapped Argentina's. Britain claimed a slice that overlapped both. Australia claimed the largest single wedge. Norway, France, and New Zealand claimed their own. Two more nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, refused to recognize anyone's claim but reserved the right to make their own. That is not a scientific arrangement. That is a map that is about to go to war. Everyone at the time understood this. Antarctica in 1958 had every ingredient of a global flashpoint: contested territory, no established sovereignty, military logistics already flowing in, and two superpowers watching each other from opposite sides of a continent no one had ever fought over. The Cold War almost went south literally before it went anywhere else. And then, in the span of about 18 months, all of that pressure vanished. The claims froze in place. The bases were reclassified as scientific. And on December 1, 1959, 12 nations signed a treaty that, on paper, did four things. 1. It banned all military activity on the continent. No bases, no maneuvers, no weapons testing. 2. It banned nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste anywhere below 60 degrees south latitude. 3. It suspended all territorial claims. Nobody had to give up their claim, but nobody could enforce it either. The map went into a kind of legal freezer. And 4. The one the tourist brochures never quote, it required every signatory to give advance notice of every expedition, every base, every piece of equipment, every person sent to the continent. And it gave every other signatory the right to inspect any facility at any time. That last clause is the reason you personally cannot go to Antarctica. You are not a signatory. You are a private citizen, and if you want to visit the continent independently, off the approved cruise routes, off the guided trails into anywhere that actually matters, you need a permit from your national Antarctic program. And that permit will be denied. Not sometimes. In practice, almost always. The treaty entered into force on June 23, 1961. Additional signatories were added over the following decades, and today the Antarctic Treaty System has more than 50 parties. In 1991, a supplementary document called the Madrid Protocol was added, extending the ban on mineral exploitation until at least 2048 and reinforcing the environmental restrictions on independent travel. If you take the treaty at face value, this is one of the great success stories of 20th century diplomacy. A continent removed from Cold War competition. Nuclear-free. Militarily neutral. Preserved for science and peace. And here is where the official story starts to sound very strange if you listen carefully. Because the Antarctic Treaty is one of the only major arms control agreements from the entire 20th century that both the Americans and the Soviets not only signed, but actively enforced against their own citizens and against each other, without a single documented violation. Not one. No U-2 incidents. No submarine standoffs. No expelled diplomats. Nothing. That is not how superpowers behave. Not on any subject, not in any treaty, not anywhere else on Earth. So the question is not whether the treaty was signed. The question is why it held. And to start answering that, you have to go back another 14 years, to the largest military operation the United States Navy ever launched at the bottom of the world. August 1946. World War II has been over for exactly 1 year. The United States is in the middle of a massive military demobilization. Aircraft carriers are being mothballed. Fleets are being scrapped. And in the middle of all that, the U.S. Navy decides to launch the largest single expedition it has ever sent to Antarctica. Before or since, the operation was called Highjump. Its official designation was the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, 1946 to 1947. Its commander on paper was Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen. Its actual public face was one of the most famous polar explorers alive at the time, Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the man who had already led 4 private expeditions to the continent. The scale of Highjump is difficult to overstate. Task Force 68 consisted of 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, the seaplane tenders Pine Island and Currituck, the destroyer Brownson, 2 icebreakers, a submarine named Senate, 33 aircraft, and roughly 4,700 men. Compare that to the scientific bases sent down there a decade later. A typical research station operated with fewer than 50 people. Highjump put an armed fleet on the water bigger than what most nations use to invade a country. The stated mission was a mix of things. Training personnel in extreme cold conditions. Testing equipment. Extending scientific knowledge of the continent. Consolidating and extending U.S. sovereign claims. That last one is important. This was not a research trip. This was a soft military occupation. The operation was scheduled to run for 6 to 8 months. It was terminated after roughly 8 weeks. The official reason for the early wrap was weather. The Antarctic summer had turned unusually severe, aircraft were being damaged, and the mission's tempo could not be sustained. That is the reason in the Navy report. It is the reason repeated in the encyclopedias. Then there is the other version. In March of 1947, shortly after Highjump was cut short, the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio ran an article that quoted Admiral Byrd on the record. The quote, as it appeared in that newspaper, warned that the United States needed to adopt defensive measures against hostile aircraft that could fly, in his words, from pole to pole at incredible speeds. That quote, its exact wording, its exact context, has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue it is genuine. Others argue it was a mistranslation or a fragment taken out of context. What is not debated is that the article ran in that newspaper in that month. The eyewitness accounts from the enlisted men who served on Highjump are murkier still. Over the years, decades after the fact, various former crew members claimed the task force encountered aggressive craft, described sometimes as disc-shaped, sometimes as silvery, sometimes as coming out of the water, that engaged U.S. aircraft and drove the fleet back. Ships were reportedly damaged. Men were reportedly killed. None of that is in the official casualty log, which records the loss of 3 men in a single PBM Mariner crash in December 1946 and nothing else. So what actually happened during those 8 weeks? Honestly, we do not know. The declassified Highjump records confirm the scale, the ships, the aircraft, the early termination, and the weather explanation. The classified portions have never been fully released. Beyond that, we have one Spanish newspaper article and a long tail of secondhand testimony from men who told their stories only decades later. If you like this kind of investigation where we separate the documented record from the testimonial record instead of blending them, do us a small favor and hit the like button. It is the single thing that tells YouTube to show this to people who care about the difference. Whatever happened during Highjump, whether the weather really was that bad, whether Byrd really said what El Mercurio printed, whether anything was engaged over the ice, one thing is not in dispute. The United States never launched another operation on that scale in Antarctica again. Not during the rest of the Cold War. Not during the Reagan buildup. Not now. And 13 years after Highjump ended, the Navy quietly agreed to the treaty that placed the entire continent off-limits to the very kind of Operation Highjump had been. Which brings us to the mechanism itself. What is truly enforced down there right now? If you have ever looked into visiting Antarctica, the first thing you find is that it appears surprisingly easy. There are cruise operators. There are photography expeditions. There are 10-day packages leaving from Ushuaia, Argentina, that will put you on a ship across the Drake Passage and land you, in an inflatable Zodiac, on a beach where you can walk among penguins and photograph a Chilean research station. During the 2023 to 2024 season, roughly 74,000 tourists visited Antarctica this way. That number sounds enormous. And it is exactly the number the industry wants you to remember. Because it is designed to answer the question you and I are asking in this video, the question of why access is restricted, with a simple, disarming reply. Access is not restricted. Anyone can go. Look at the brochures. Which is where you have to look very carefully at what those brochures actually let you see. Almost every one of those 74,000 tourists goes to the same place. The Antarctic Peninsula. The thin finger of land that curves up towards South America, the closest part of the continent to any inhabited landmass. It represents less than 1% of Antarctica's surface. Tourists are not permitted to land at more than about 50 pre-approved sites. Ships carrying more than 500 passengers are forbidden from putting anyone ashore at all. And no landing site can host more than 100 people at once. These rules are enforced by the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, and they are strictly followed. So when you look at a globe and see the whole continent, 14 million square kilometers, and you assume tourism gives you access to any of it, what you are actually looking at is a coastal ribbon on one side of one peninsula. The interior of the continent, the Transantarctic Mountains, the region called Byrd Land where our earlier disappearance happened, the huge area around the South Pole, the subglacial lakes, the massive ice shelves, none of that is on any tourist itinerary. None of it. Ever. There is one private operator that goes further. A company called Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions runs flights from Punta Arenas, Chile, into a camp called Union Glacier, deep in the interior. From there they offer trips to the South Pole and to Mount Vinson, Antarctica's highest peak. The season runs for a few weeks each year. It costs tens of thousands of dollars. And even those trips follow strictly pre-approved corridors. You do not get to fly wherever you want. You get to be moved between specific points on a map, by a specific operator, along specific tracks that were negotiated in advance with the U.S. Antarctic program and cleared with treaty authorities. If you want to go beyond that, launch a private expedition, fly your own aircraft across the interior, camp in an unapproved location, enter one of the many Antarctic specially protected areas without a research permit, you need approval from your national Antarctic program. If you are American, that program is administered by the National Science Foundation. If you are British, by the British Antarctic Survey. And so on down the list. Ask anyone who has actually tried to get one of these permits for a non-research purpose. The permit is not denied on the spot. It is not shouted at you. It is quietly, procedurally, endlessly deferred. Environmental impact statements are requested. Search and rescue plans are demanded. Insurance requirements escalate. Route corridors are narrowed. And by the time you have complied with everything, either the season is over or your route has been cropped down to somewhere no one cares about anyway. That is how the door is really kept closed. Not with fences. Not with a sign. With paperwork. Now layer on top of all of that a second thing. Every U.S. Antarctic program employee, every contractor, every scientist, every logistics worker at McMurdo or the South Pole Station, signs a non-disclosure agreement covering operational details of their work. And there are airspace corridors around specific parts of the continent that no aircraft, tourist or private, is permitted to cross under any circumstances. Those corridors are why a U.S. Navy flight engineer named Brian in 1985 saw something he was never supposed to see. And that is exactly where the mechanism stops looking like environmental protection and starts looking like something else altogether. Everything in the last block was documented. Signed treaties. Public NSF procedures. Publicly available IATO regulations. What follows now is different. It is testimony. Specifically, it is the testimony of one man. He goes by Brian. That is not his full name. He served in the United States Navy for years, flew hundreds of missions over Antarctica as a C-130 flight engineer, and although he never signed a formal non-disclosure agreement, he still refuses to say his last name on the record. His story was collected by the journalist Linda Moulton Howe and aggregated by the Y-Files documentary series. It has not been independently verified. Read it that way. But read it. Sometime in the early 1980s, Brian's C-130 crew was flying routine Antarctic support missions. Resupply runs. Personnel rotations. Cargo drops. The Navy called them milk runs. Then one day the crew received an emergency order. They were to prepare for a medical evacuation. A scientist at Davis Station, an Australian research base on the opposite side of the continent, had been badly injured. The C-130 would pick up medical personnel at McMurdo and fly across the Transantarctic Mountains toward the South Pole. As they climbed, Brian noticed something odd. The navigator was plotting a route that ran directly over a facility Brian had heard about but never seen. On the flight charts it was labeled Air Sampling Station. It sat inside a permanent airspace exclusion zone. No aircraft was permitted to overfly it under any circumstances. Under normal orders you would divert wide around it and add an hour to your route. But this was a medevac. And medevac protocol allowed the crew to violate the exclusion zone if a patient's life was at stake. This one was. So they went straight over it. What Brian saw, according to his testimony, was a hole in the ice roughly 90 meters across. The size of a soccer field. It had been dug or cut clean, not calved off naturally. Around the rim and leading down into it were footprints. Dozens of them. Human footprints, in a place where officially there was no human activity beyond a few unmanned instruments monitoring atmospheric samples. The crew flew over it, delivered their patients to McMurdo, and expected the incident to end there. It did not. They were called into the commanding officer's briefing room. Waiting for them were two men Brian had never seen before. They were not in Navy uniform. They were not in Air Force uniform. They were in civilian suits, and Brian would later say they had, in his words, the look of Washington, D.C. He meant that the way you would mean it if you had been in the military long enough to recognize an intelligence agency handler on site. The civilian men did not raise their voices. They did not threaten anyone. They simply informed the crew calmly that the following statements were now facts. They had not overflown the exclusion zone. They had not seen any hole in any ice. They would never fly over that area again. They would never mention the flight to anyone. Ever. The crew agreed. What else were they going to do? Months later, Brian was on a routine cargo run to the South Pole, where the geodesic dome station was then in operation. In the mess hall he overheard a group of civilian contractors talking about the same site. They were going back, they said, to meet the visitors. Brian assumed at first they meant a research delegation. Then he heard the tone shift and the phrasing, and something they said made him ask directly, "What visitors?" And one of them replied, in the way a person answers a question they have already answered too many times, that his impression was that the visitors were not human. That is the testimony. That is all of it. It is the account of one former sailor who saw a hole in ice he was not supposed to see, and overheard a conversation he was not supposed to overhear. No photographs of the hole have ever surfaced publicly. No other member of that specific C-130 crew has come forward to corroborate the debrief. The airspace exclusion around the South Pole region is real and documented. The rest of it rests on Brian's word. Which brings us to the point in this investigation where the question stops being about who saw what, and starts being about something older. Because if the interior of Antarctica is being actively hidden from private access, the question is not just what is under the ice today. The question is who knew it was there long before us. In 1929, a group of Ottoman historians cleaning out the old imperial library at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul came across a piece of gazelle skin parchment that had been sitting on a shelf, ignored, for 400 years. It was a map. A section of a much larger world map that had been mostly lost. In the margin, in Ottoman Turkish, its author had left a signature and a date. The name was Piri Reis, a senior admiral in the Ottoman Navy. The date was the equivalent of 1513. What made the map a historical curiosity in 1929 was its accuracy. The coastline of Europe was there. West Africa was there. Most notably, the eastern coastline of South America was mapped in detail, only 21 years after Columbus made landfall. That in itself was surprising, but not shocking. Piri Reis wrote openly in his notes that he had compiled his map from around 20 older source maps, some of them dating back, he claimed, to the time of Alexander the Great. What made the Piri Reis map an actual mystery came 30 years later. In 1960, an American historian named Charles Hapgood, then teaching at Keene State College in New Hampshire, was studying the map with a group of his students. Below the coastline of South America, the map depicted another landmass. Hapgood thought it looked like a coastline of Antarctica. Which was impossible, because Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. And if it was Antarctica, it was Antarctica without ice. Hapgood did what a serious researcher does. He sent the map to the United States Air Force. Specifically, to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, whose commanding officer was a lieutenant colonel named Harold Z. Ohlmeyer. Ohlmeyer's job was to analyze aerial and satellite reconnaissance photography. His squadron had just spent years mapping Antarctica for the U.S. military under the International Geophysical Year. If anyone alive in 1960 could say what a real ice-free Antarctic coastline looked like, it was that squadron. On July 6, 1960, Ohlmeyer sent Hapgood a written reply on official Air Force letterhead. That letter is not disputed. It exists. It is quoted in Hapgood's later book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and it has been reproduced many times since. In it, Ohlmeyer stated that the lower portion of the Piri Reis map appeared to represent the Princess Martha coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, and that the details of the coastline agreed with the results of the 1949 Norwegian-British-Swedish seismic survey conducted through the ice cap. Read that again slowly. A United States Air Force reconnaissance officer, in 1960, said in writing that a map drawn in 1513 shows a coastline of Antarctica that was only rediscovered by seismic imaging in 1949. Ohlmeyer added, at the end of the same letter, that he could not conceive of how the data on the map could be reconciled with the supposed state of geographic knowledge in the year 1513. That letter is the pin. It is what you cannot easily pull out. There is a mainstream reply, and it deserves to be heard. Academic cartographers have argued for decades that the landmass at the bottom of the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all. It is the coastline of South America, they say, distorted by the projection Piri Reis was working from, wrapped around the bottom edge of the parchment because he ran out of space. On that reading, the resemblance to Queen Maud Land is a visual accident. Nothing more. Both interpretations are, at this point, honestly held. What is harder to explain away is a second map. Drawn 18 years later by a completely different person, using completely different sources. The map is called the Orontius Phineas map. It was published in 1531 by a French mathematician and cartographer named Orens Fine. And unlike Piri Reis, Fine did not just show a fragment of a southern coastline. He drew the entire continent of Antarctica, centered on the South Pole, with mountain ranges, river valleys, and coastal outlines that Hapgood and later analysts argued correspond to features we now know exist under the ice. which raises a question that the mainstream cartographic community has never given a satisfying answer to, in almost a century of analysis. Where, exactly, did Orance Fine, sitting in Paris in 1531, get a map of a continent that officially would not be seen by human eyes for another 3 centuries? Hapgood had an answer to that question. It was not a small answer. In 1958, 2 years before the Ohlmeyer letter, Hapgood published a book called Earth's Shifting Crust. In it he argued that the entire outer crust of the Earth is capable of sliding over its molten interior, and that this sliding can happen not over hundreds of millions of years, in the slow way plate tectonics moves continents, but relatively quickly. Over centuries. Possibly less. And that in doing so, the crust can shift so far that entire continents change latitude, entire climates flip, and locations that were once temperate become polar. If that sounds like fringe science, consider who wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. Not a friendly colleague. Not a fellow historian. Albert Einstein. Einstein's foreword is a matter of published record. You can find it in the original 1958 edition. In it he wrote that Hapgood's central idea was, in Einstein's own words, original, of great simplicity, and if it continued to prove itself, of great importance to everything related to the history of the Earth's surface. That is the strongest endorsement Einstein ever gave to a theory later dismissed by mainstream academia. Because it was dismissed. Modern plate tectonics, developed and validated during the 1960s and 1970s, provided a slower, more mechanical, more experimentally supported model of how continents actually move. Hapgood's rapid crustal displacement is not accepted by professional geology today. It is treated, in most university geology departments, as an interesting historical curiosity, not as a working hypothesis. But it is not dead. And the reason it is not dead is that other pieces of the puzzle have continued to arrive. Consider what we now know about Antarctica's deep past. In 2020, a team led by geologist Johann Klages, at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, published a peer-reviewed paper in Nature. Their team drilled a sediment core from the seabed off West Antarctica, and inside that core they found pollen, spores, and preserved plant root networks from a temperate rainforest. A biologically diverse forest, of the kind you would find today in southern New Zealand. The dating placed it at roughly 90 million years ago in the middle of the Cretaceous. That part is uncontroversial. Antarctica had a rainforest. Mainstream science has known for years that the continent was ice-free for enormous stretches of its history. The question is when, exactly, the ice returned. And whether it might have returned much more recently in some regions than the standard timeline says. Which brings us to the other thing that keeps refusing to die. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. First proposed in 2007 by a team including the geochemist Richard Firestone, it argues that around 12,800 years ago, a fragment of a comet struck or airburst over the northern hemisphere. The resulting fire, dust, and glacial meltwater triggered a sudden climatic reversal that plunged the Earth back into near-ice age conditions, wiped out most of North America's megafauna, and coincided with the disappearance of the Clovis culture. Sediment cores from more than 50 sites across 4 continents now show a thin layer of nanodiamonds, platinum, and glassy microspherules dated to that moment. The impact hypothesis is contested, but it is not dismissed the way it was 15 years ago. Peer-reviewed evidence for the layer keeps accumulating. Now put those 3 things next to each other. A pre-modern map that shows an ice-free Antarctica. A theoretical mechanism endorsed by Einstein for how a continent could rapidly change latitude. And an actual cataclysmic event, dated to roughly 12,800 years ago, that mainstream science increasingly accepts happened. You do not need to believe any of these on their own. You can hold them at arm's length individually. But when you set them side by side, the picture that emerges is uncomfortable enough that it will not go quietly. If you want to stay with this investigation as it walks into that discomfort, because in the next block we are going deeper, into the buried structures and the disappearing scientific team, hit subscribe. That is the single move that keeps the next episode landing in your feed instead of getting lost. Now we come at last to a much stranger layer. Something is being kept out of public view under that ice. And someone knew it was there long ago. November 1995. Byrd Land, on the southwestern edge of the Antarctic continent, is one of the most remote pieces of land on Earth. It is the largest unclaimed territory in the world. Not a single nation has ever filed a legal claim to it. In November of 1995, according to Brian, the same U.S. Navy flight engineer who overflew the exclusion zone a decade earlier, a small research team from the National Science Foundation was deployed there. 15 scientists, standard equipment, standard mission, ice cores, weather monitoring, wildlife observation. Protocol required a daily radio check-in with McMurdo Station, several hundred kilometers to the east. After several days of silence from the camp, AC-130 was dispatched. Brian's crew flew it. When they arrived overhead, the sky was clear. The visibility was good. They could see the huts, the fuel drums, the snowmobiles lined up neatly. They could see the equipment. But no people. No bodies. No footprints leading away. Nothing. It was as if the 15 scientists had walked out of their own outlines. A rescue party landed. The radio inside the main hut was working. Food supplies were intact. There was no sign of a struggle. No sign of a departure. There was nothing to do. The orders came back from McMurdo. Fly one more pattern and come home. Brian's crew did and returned to base. Just over a week later, McMurdo received a radio call from the Byrd Land camp. The scientists were somehow back. They were, in Brian's word, panicked. They wanted out immediately. His crew was scrambled a second time. When they landed, the 15 scientists were waiting on the ice in complete silence. They had packed their equipment onto pallets in a hurry. They boarded the aircraft without speaking. The crew offered them coffee, food, blankets. Nothing. Not one of them said a word for the entire 2-hour flight back to McMurdo. Brian described them as catatonic. When the aircraft landed, some refused or were unable to unbuckle. The crew had to physically lift them and walk them like sleepwalkers onto a second waiting aircraft. That aircraft left immediately. The equipment was quarantined in a locked hangar. That is the account. It is Brian's account. It has not been corroborated by any named member of that scientific team, and no National Science Foundation record of a mass evacuation from Byrd Land in November 1995 has ever surfaced publicly. But it does not stop there. Because in 2003, according to a separate anonymous witness, a former U.S. Navy SEAL who agreed to be interviewed by the journalist Linda Moulton how only under the codename Spartan One, a special operations team was inserted into the region of the Beardmore Glacier. Their assignment was described to them as a scientific extraction. Retrieve a researcher and his data and return to McMurdo. According to Spartan One's testimony, as they approached the coordinates they found a structure. An octagonal shape, dark, roughly 5.5 meters tall above the ice, with more of it clearly submerged below. It had a door 7 meters high. Engraved on that door was, in his description, what appeared to be a stellar map, and a symbol he recognized as a triangle with 2 crossed lines through the center. When they pushed the door, it swung open easily on some kind of perfect balance. Inside, the temperature was room warm. The chamber was enormous. Walls emitted their own soft green light. Their researcher was already there taking photographs. That is Spartan One's account. There is no photograph. There is no verifiable identity. There is no debrief document. It is one man's story, given years later to one journalist. What is documented and what the mainstream will not deny is this. Multiple pyramid-shaped and geometrically anomalous features have been found in Google Earth imagery of Antarctica since roughly 2016. The scientific consensus is that these are natural rock formations called nunataks, exposed peaks pushing through the ice sheet. That is the official reading and it may well be correct. But the imagery and the specific coordinates people have flagged over the years have in several documented cases been altered, blurred, or removed from Google Earth in later updates. That censoring is real and observable and has never been explained by Google. Which leaves one awkward final question. If everything down there is just ice, rock, and penguins, why is any of it being edited out of the map? Go back to the paneled room in Washington in the winter of 1959. 12 nations sitting around a table. The Cold War at its most dangerous point. The Soviet delegation and the American delegation still in the same city where, less than 3 years later, they would nearly go to nuclear war over Cuba. And on this one subject, on this 114 million square kilometer continent, both sides quietly agreeing that no private citizen would ever go there alone, that no aircraft would fly across corridors of it under any circumstances, that no equipment would be brought in without notice, and that every base could be inspected at any time by anyone else who had signed. That is the piece of the story that does not require any testimony to establish. That is the piece that sits on paper in State Department archives, in the Antarctic Treaty Collection, in the enabling legislation of every signatory nation. It is public. It is verifiable. It is unbroken. What we cannot verify is Brian, the flight engineer, and the hole in the ice, and the men in civilian suits from Washington. We cannot verify Spartan One, the SEAL, and the octagonal structure with the 7-meter door. We cannot verify what happened to the 15 scientists in Byrd Land. Those stories rest on the word of individuals whose full names we do not know, whose careers we cannot audit, whose accounts have not been corroborated by anyone standing next to them at the time. What we also cannot easily explain away is the Piri Reis map, and the Orontius Phineas map, and the letter from Lieutenant Colonel Ohlmeyer on Air Force letterhead in 1960, and the 90-million-year-old rainforest that we now know existed under West Antarctica, and the growing peer-reviewed evidence for an impact around 12,800 years ago that appears to have reshaped this planet in a matter of days. None of that proves ancient cities under the ice. None of it proves alien structures. None of it proves anything about what Brian or Spartan One or the missing 15 actually saw. What it does prove is that the story we are told about Antarctica, a continent frozen and empty for millions of years, a treaty signed for the pure love of penguins and pristine science, an interior sealed behind procedural walls and airspace exclusions, is not the whole story. It cannot be because the pieces do not fit. Somewhere between what the documents say and what the witnesses claim, there is a truth that both sides of this argument are dancing around. And whether that truth is a lost civilization or a Cold War weapons secret that outlived the Cold War, or a genuinely extraterrestrial presence, or something none of us have imagined yet, one thing is settled by the evidence we already have. The most powerful governments in the world know something about the bottom of this planet that they have not told the rest of us. And they have quietly cooperated for 66 years to make sure the rest of us never find out on our own. So here is the question I want to hand back to you. Because this is a story where your own read matters, and where the comments section is going to be as valuable as the video itself. Look at what we walked through today and tell me your honest position on 3 things. First, do you believe the Antarctic Treaty was really signed to protect science, or to lock down something both superpowers had already found and did not want the other publicizing? Second, where do you draw the line between the documented record and the testimonial record? Do you count Brian's account as evidence or a story? And third, if a future government opened Antarctica to independent exploration and told you that you could go anywhere on the continent, would you go or would you stay home? Drop your answers below. Not just one word. Argue it. Because this is exactly the kind of question that gets figured out in the space between careful readers, not in the silence of official press releases. If this investigation was worth your time, hit the like button, because that is what tells YouTube to put it in front of the next person who cares. Subscribe if you are not already, because we are going to keep pulling on threads like this one, the places where the official story and the physical evidence stop matching up. Thank you for making it all the way here today. The bottom of the world is a long way to travel, even in your own head. We will see you in the next one.